Hello and welcome to the Amateur Austenite. My name is Frances Duncan. I'm an author and the founder of the Jane Austen Society of New Zealand. My co-host is my friend Sian.
Hello.
And today we are discussing the cancelled chapter of Persuasion. This would be chapter 22 in the original and there would be no chapter 23. It would go straight to chapter 24. In this version, Anne is going to see Lady Russell to tell her about Mr. Elliot. She's walking down Gay Street and runs into Admiral Croft, who insists that she come in and see his wife, even though his wife is currently with her dressmaker. He says there's nobody else inside, then ushers her into a room with Captain Wentworth, which is really awkward. Captain Wentworth and Admiral Croft have a talk outside in the hall, which Anne can hear half of. Then Captain Wentworth comes back into the room and says, "So we found out that you're going to marry your cousin and that you want to live at Callant Hall. What about the Admiral's lease of Callant Hall? Do you want to end that?" And Anne says, No. Then they look at each other. There's no real let's get back together. They look at each other and it's decided that they're back together. Then Anne stays for dinner and the Admiral and Mrs. Croft keep running out of the room to leave her and Captain Wentworth alone. And she has a lovely evening.
She has a very lovely evening.
I think that's how the chapter ends. Oh, she goes home and stays up half the night thinking about it and then goes to bed and can't sleep anyway and ends up with a headache and fatigue.
It was definitely not the most tightly written of chapters, was it? Mind you, reading it on your phone is a bit of a challenge.
I looked it up online and I've been reading it on my phone where there are no paragraph breaks and not all of the punctuation is in there. So it's a bit hard to read.
It felt a little bit more far-fetched, like she was forcing into the story to try and almost come to a conclusion. I think she rather liked the idea of Mr. and Mrs. Croft as being like the Deus Ex Machina, bring them together, which of course in this version they do particularly.
A bit like the Gardeners bringing Lizzie and Darcy together. They're both the couple that encapsulates a good marriage and they're sort of credited with bringing the couple together to a certain extent.
So it's hard to know, did they believe what was being said? Or did they want to get her alone with Fredrick because they felt that she was much more inclined his way?
I don't know about that. I think that might be reading a bit far into it.
Probably. I think the version they went with was definitely more satisfying because you got background, you got the talk with the letter, you got the talk about the strength of feeling between men and women. So you got a lot more opportunities for people to make comments and things, whereas this really could have been just incredibly uncomfortable, which it was for Anne. It almost became a little bit of a farce.
Yes, it's quite amusing that Admiral and Mrs. Croft finding excuses to leave the room.
Yes.
And leave them alone. Even the way that Admiral is so insistent that Anne come inside and see Mrs. Croft is quite funny. Even though he's lovely, you could see it as a little bit offensive that he won't take no for an answer.
And while we know that he's a sort of a very blunt sailor, he's not impolite. He must have a certain amount of diplomacy and skill set to have got to the role he has. Interesting, actually. What we're going to have here is in our next book, another admiral who's completely different.
The Crawford's uncle, who brings his mistress into his house.
Yes.
Mrs. Croft is with her dressmaker this whole time. It's quite clear that the Admiral wants someone to have this conversation with Anne and get it over with so he knows whether they have Callant or whether they need to find somewhere else to live.
Yes, because he doesn't trust Sir Walter in the slightest.
I suppose it is quite a delicate subject. So it's something that he doesn't feel he can raise, so he wants Mrs. Croft to do it. But then he's like, Fredrick can do it, that's convenient. And it's really not.
No, that's right. So, in one hand, you never really know whether he's astute or he's actually completely oblivious.
I think anybody else pushing as hard as he did for her to stay, it would be offensive. But because he's so lovely.
And he's always been very kind to her and considerate.
It's hilarious the talk they have out in the hall.
Oh, yes.
She can tell that it's Captain Wentworth who makes sure the door is closed. Because the Admiral was just going to have the whole talk with the door open so she could hear everything.
Which is why I believe there's an element of calculation about it. Because I just don't think he's that silly not to recognise. You know, he would have had private conversations. He also then made sure his voice was loud enough to be heard.
It was very funny though. We laughed a lot reading this.
It just was ridiculous.
And Jane Austen isn't usually so laugh out loud funny in her more mature works. In a juvenilia, yes, but not in her more mature works.
Yes, so maybe it was a sort of I'm hurrying to finish this off after all the seriousness. Maybe she did want a little bit of levity.
But then she still ended it on that note about the Navy. The
Yes.
warning that he's going back to war. Captain Wentworth sort of apologises for the Admiral and says he is a man who can never be thought impertinent by one who knows him as you do. His intentions are always the kindest and the best.
Yes, so he recognises it was very uncomfortable for her, but no malice in the Admiral.
You wonder where he got this information, because someone has specifically told the Admiral Anne is engaged to her cousin. They are going to want to live in Kellynch. You are going to need to end your lease.
He would have been at the club or something like that. Mr. Elliot goes to the clubs. Mr. Elliot would be saying some of these things. Or Mrs. Clay might be saying some of these things.
What's interesting about this storyline, that they're going to be married and they're going to want to live at Kellynch, is that it does crop up in the adaptations often.
If you think about it, what happens with any type of story or tale? You tell me, oh, did you know so-and-so is getting married? And then somebody will say, oh, well, I wonder if they'll want to move, now he's got money, they can go back into Kellynch. Somebody over there will have heard the conversation or heard, he'll be wanting the lease back. So what was a speculative comment becomes an actual desire on the part of somebody. Before you know it, you've got this whole story. Now, whether that was deliberately set around, because I think Mr. Elliot's realising at this point that Anne is not enamoured of him, particularly when she's quite oblivious to his proposal, deliberately so. Anybody else would have been, bashful, shy and things like that, but she's made a point of not being so. I could speculate that in the background he's trying to put a situation where it puts pressure on her.
Because it would ruin her reputation if a story went around that she was engaged and she said no.
Not so much to ruin her reputation, but per se as to, he knows Lady Russell would support it. He knows Sir Walter would sort of support it. Mr. Elliot's clever enough to manipulate. He knows Elizabeth wouldn't support it in the least. Particularly in those days, it would have been very difficult for her to have backed out, just as it would have been difficult for Captain Wentworth to have backed out from his relationship or perceived relationship with Louisa. Maybe that's what Jane was actually doing, was doing the reverse with Mr. Elliot and Anne as she did with Fredrick and Louisa.
So what gets cut out is the Musgroves coming to Bath.
Oh, of course.
The evening party at Camden Place.
That's right.
And obviously the letter. And that lovely conversation with Captain Harville.
That's much more subtle than the Admiral. More in line with how the rest of the book's gone. Because Captain Harville's been a key influence, I think, on the story in the sense of the Lyme tale, the Benwick, the looking after Louisa, he and his wife.
And I think it's interesting to get a look at how he is feeling about the engagement between Captain Benwick and Louisa.
Because he is still mourning his sister, quite severely mourning his sister. He's finding it difficult to understand why Captain Benwick isn't. But of course, to a certain extent, there's an out of sight, out of mind with Captain Benwick, because he was at sea while his sister was sick and dying.
And he hadn't known her his whole life,
yeah,
like Captain Harville had.
Yes. I think sometimes with Austen, there's for her a perception that you can get these surface sensitivities, but they don't have the depth that some of the more subtly expressed feelings are. So just because Anne doesn't go around weeping and wailing, because Eleanor doesn't go around weeping and wailing, Jane doesn't go around weeping and wailing, does not mean to say they do not feel intensely. Whereas the Louisas, Captain Benwick, those characters, they're all out there, they're all sensitive, but they don't necessarily, just because they have this more demonstrative type emotion, doesn't mean to say they feel it anymore, or in fact are affected as long as.
Captain Wentworth says, "A very few words in reply from you will be sufficient." And she says something that doesn't make any sense. She spoke a word or two, but they were unintelligible. And he says, "Just tell me that the Admiral can send a line to Sir Walter. Just say he may." And then Anne is finally able to speak. "No, sir. There is no message. You are misinformed. The Admiral is misinformed."
So she's up front at that point.
She struggles at first, but yes, then she actually says, she actually speaks. And there's so much of this where Anne doesn't speak. In fact, even there, he now sat down, drew it a little nearer to her, and looked with an expression which had something more than penetration in it, something softer. Her countenance did not discourage. It was a silent but a very powerful dialogue, on his side supplication, on hers acceptance. Still a little nearer, and a hand taken and pressed. And it says they were reunited. They were restored to all that had been lost. There's no, "By the way, I love you."
No. No, none of that.
Not any actual exchange there, apart from a look. What if you're not good at reading a look?
And that's possibly it. But then, I suppose she wouldn't have held his hand.
Then not long after, Mrs. Croft comes in, and it says, after the observations of the next 10 minutes, saw something to suspect, and wishes that she was still with her dressmaker, imprisoned by her dressmaker.
Actually, I really like that line. There's a real sense of humour in that piece, isn't there?
And so Anne stays for dinner because it's raining, and the husband and wife, either by the wife's contrivance or by simply going on the usual way, were frequently out of the room together. And then it lists stupid things that they do to be out of the room. Anne and Captain Wentworth are able to have snatches of conversation, which in the other chapters happened while they were walking her back to her house, and during the evening party when they were admiring the plants.
There's a lot more manipulation to give them the time alone here. I'm not sure that would have worked as well for Anne as the walk, which would have been much more private.
Because this feels rushed. We must talk as much as we can while they're out of the room. But a lot of the same things are covered, that he came to know himself at Lyme, that immediately he found that Louisa was engaged. He knew he had to come to Bath. It doesn't have that lovely bit where he says, "If I had come back 2 years later."
There's a lot less of the conversation. As I said, it's much more of that farcical Admiral and Mrs. Croft sort of leaping in and out of the room on whims, as it were.
It is very funny, though. It makes me think of the classic English comedy where people are running up and down hallways and in and out of doors.
That's why I'm saying it's that English farce approach.
Yes. So persuasion comes up a lot in this chapter, and I don't think it comes up that often in the published chapter. If I was wrong in yielding to persuasion once, remember that it was to persuasion exerted on the side of safety, not of risk.
Basically, what she was saying there is that marrying Mr. Elliot would have been a risk, not safety.
They do have, again, the Bath could scarcely contain any other two beings at once so rationally and so rapturously happy. And the funny thing is that the Admiral has no idea what's going on.
In some ways, he's quite oblivious.
But like at the evening party, Anne gets the impression that Mrs. Croft knows what's going on. Her manner, her friendly manner towards Anne, lets Anne know that Mrs. Croft knows what's going on.
And bearing in mind Mrs. Croft is Frederick's sister, I think she's also showing that she's very pleased for it, the decision. Because she would have realised that something would have upset Frederick the last time he came back.
No, she was overseas and didn't know anything about their engagement.
Oh.
Because he was staying with Mr. Wentworth.
That's right.
And she was overseas at the time, so she knew nothing about it, which is one of the things that Anne felt as a safety when she met her. But you do get the sense, again, that they will be sisters.
Yeah, they will have a much more positive relationship than she ever has with her own sisters, I think.
I wonder why it's not printed as an appendix in copies of Persuasion.
Well, it might be with more modern editions.
Because I think it's so fascinating. But I suppose that's a part of me that wants to look at the differences between the two, whereas other people were like, well, we've read the book, why would we then read more? We know the storyline.
It's of interest to literature students, but not necessarily of your average reader, unless your average reader's been a follower of fan fiction, interested in different variations of the same story. I'm looking much more now at the similarities and the common themes across the books, because one of the things we have to remember is the length of time it takes to write a story in those days, that just ripping out a story to make lots of money and use common themes, you could not do that. Everything's handwritten by hand and then handwritten again so somebody can read it. The discipline involved with it.
Holding the plot in your head.
Always we have to remember the time of which they're writing, and there would have been a lot of things that the people reading at the time would have been aware of that we are not now. People will make judgment calls on the characters, comparing them to a modern woman. Does Anne come across as a weak character in the same way as Fanny? It's going to be interesting reading the next few chapters of that.
So we have started our group read of Mansfield Park. If you'd like to be involved, contact me on my website or over Twitter and I can send you the details for that. We're doing it from the 7th of July to the 22nd of September, reading 4 chapters a week. And that is our summary of the cancelled chapter of Persuasion by Jane Austen. My name is Frances Duncan. You can find me at francesduncanwrites.com and on Twitter at Frances_Duncan. Thank you for listening and we wish you happy reading.